heat came first, a physical presence that rose in shimmering waves from the baked earth of the Sage Fork Road. It warped the world, making the distant mesas tremble and the sky a searing, merciless sheet of faded blue. The stagecoach, a dust-caked box of groaning timber and cracked leather, seemed to swim through this mirage, its progress a slow, agonizing crawl that had measured out the final 100 miles in sweat and silence. When it finally ground to a halt in the center of what passed for a town, the sudden stillness was louder than the preceding racket of wheels and hooves. Cinder Mesa wasn't a town so much as an argument with the desert, an argument it was slowly losing. A single dusty street, bookended by a livery stable at one end and a sun-bleached church at the other, was flanked by a handful of clapboard buildings whose paint had been scoured away by wind and time. The Mesquite House Hotel, the Dry Lantern Saloon, a mercantile, and a blacksmith's forge stood as weary sentinels against the vast, indifferent landscape of rock and scrub. The coach door swung open with a pained squeal. For a moment, nothing happened. The heat and the silence pressed in. Then, a single, scuffed boot appeared, followed by the dusty hem of a dark blue traveling dress. Lila Rowan descended the 3 steep steps as if stepping into deep water, her movements stiff and measured. Her gloved fingers were clenched so tightly around the handle of a cedar wood valise that her knuckles showed white through the worn fabric. The valise was small, scarred with the nicks and scrapes of a long journey, its contents a meager summary of a life hastily packed 3 dresses, carefully folded, a small daguerreotype of a woman with her same determined chin, the image tied with a faded silk ribbon, and a slim, leather-bound notebook with a pencil tucked into its spine. Her arrival rippled through the town's lethargy. Inside the Dry Lantern, a poker dealer, his sleeves held up with garters, froze with a card halfway to the table. His eyes narrowed against the glare from the doorway. On the porch of the mercantile, a young ranch hand, no older than 17, stopped his whittling, the knife still and the curl of wood falling silently into the dust by his boot. Even a rib-thin cattle dog, seeking refuge in the sliver of shade beneath the Mesquite House awning, lifted its head, its ears twitching, before slinking further into the shadows as if sensing the arrival of something fragile and foreign. The town's collective gaze was a tangible weight, a silent inventory of her person, her luggage, her purpose for being here. Every soul in Cinder Mesa knew about the mail-order bride, and they knew who she was for. He stood waiting in the road, away from the meager shade of the awnings, as if he were a part of the heat and the dust himself. He was tall, his frame lean but broad in the shoulders, dressed in practical, trail-worn clothes that had faded to the color of the earth. A low-brimmed hat cast his face in deep shadow, but it couldn't obscure the hard line of his jaw or the way he held himself with an unnerving stillness. This was Colt Merriweather. As Lila's boots touched the ground, he took a slow step forward, the dust swirling around his ankles. He stopped a respectful 10 feet away, pushing the hat back just enough to reveal eyes that were a startling, pale gray, the color of a sky that has forgotten how to rain. They held no warmth, only a quiet, assessing intensity that seemed to see right through the fine layer of grit covering her dress and into the bone-deep weariness beneath. A hint of a grin touched one side of his mouth, a lopsided, unused expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low baritone, rougher than she'd expected, like stones rubbing together. He cleared his throat. "Figured this was you. I'm Colt Merriweather." He paused, and the silence stretched, awkward and heavy. He seemed to search for something more to say, some pleasantry to smooth over the raw transaction of their meeting. The clumsy attempt at humor, when it came, landed with a thud. "Darlin, I don't bite." He let the words hang there, a foolish, ill-conceived joke meant to disarm. But the moment it left his lips, he knew it was wrong. The word bite was the language of predators, of traps, of the very thing her posture screamed she was running from. A flicker of something not fear, but a deeper, colder recognition passed through her eyes. He saw it, and the lopsided grin vanished, replaced by a look of profound regret. "Apologies, ma'am," he said quickly, the softness in his tone a stark contrast to his earlier roughness. He held up a hand, palm open, a universal gesture of peace. That was uncalled for. "My manners have been keeping company with horses too long." Lila offered no response, not even a nod. Her world had shrunk to the space around her, her senses on high alert. Her gaze didn't stay on him but moved past him, cataloging the layout of the street, the distance to the saloon door, the alley between the mercantile and the blacksmith, the height of the porch railings, the angle of the sun and the shadows it cast. These were the calculations of a creature that had learned to survive by memorizing the shape of every potential cage, every possible escape route. She had survived by noticing, and she noticed everything about this man, the way he immediately corrected his mistake, the lack of any lingering smirk, the genuine contrition in his voice. She noticed, but she did not trust. Colt seemed to understand. He gave a short, accepting dip of his chin and moved forward, his steps deliberate. He didn't reach for her, but for the valise she still clutched. His calloused fingers brushed hers as he took it, and she fought the instinct to flinch away. He lifted the case as if it were made of fragile glass, not wood and leather, his movements careful and considerate. He turned without another word and began to walk, not beside her, but a few paces ahead, granting her a buffer of air and space, a silent acknowledgement of her fear. She followed, her own steps small and hesitant on the unfamiliar ground. The space he gave her felt less like courtesy and more like the caution one affords a spooked mare. As they walked, the whispers of the town seemed to follow them, carried on the hot, dry wind. Rumors, she knew, were the currency of a place like this, and she had no doubt that Colt Merriweather was a man who generated his fair share. She could almost hear them now, swirling in the dust with the clicking of the telegraph key from the station office, a sound like distant, ominous thunder. They say he was a lawman once, down in the Panhandle. No, he was an Army scout. I heard he faced down Jedediah Kane over a water rights claim, never even drew his pistol, just stood there until Kane backed down, walked away from a duel he didn't start. The other man didn't. That last one seemed to stick in the air, a chilling testament to the quiet lethality that seemed to emanate from the man whose back she now followed. The telegraph continued its frantic chatter, a reminder of a larger, more violent world beyond this personal, silent drama. News of cattle lines being cut north of Turnstone Wash, of rustlers growing bold. It was a land of constant, low-grade warfare, over cattle, over water, over pride. Colt led her past the last of the town's buildings, their path taking them toward a small, solitary ranch house set back from the road, marked by a single, tireless windmill. They passed a large, wind-scoured cistern, its stone sides bleached and cracked, and a stand of juniper trees that looked more like skeletons, their branches clawing at the sky, stripped bare by years of drought. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, offering no comfort, no softness. It was a place that demanded resilience, and it occurred to Lila that the man and the land were well matched. His house was small and tidy, built of hand-hewn timber with a sturdy-looking fieldstone chimney. It was a place built for function, not for show. A neat stack of firewood rested against one wall, and the yard, though barren of grass, was swept clean of debris. It spoke of a life of order and solitude. He stopped at the porch, setting her valise down gently beside the door. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the deep shadows of the porch roof. He kept his distance, his hands loose at his sides. "There's a room," he said, his voice low and even, stripped of any pretense or awkward humor. "The one on the left, it has a lock on the inside." He let that sink in, giving her a moment to process the significance of the words. A lock on the inside was not a way to keep someone in. It was a way to keep the world out. It was a gift of power, of control, to a person who likely had none. He looked away then, his gaze fixed on the turning vanes of the windmill. "You've had a long ride. You owe me nothing tonight." He paused, and his next words were quieter, but carried even more weight, or ever. Lila stared at him, at this stranger who was supposed to be her husband, this man of rumored violence who now stood before her offering not demands, but sanctuary. She had read the letters, with their simple, honest words promising a home and a respectable life, a partnership built on mutual need in a hard land. But letters were paper and ink, easily filled with the lies. This was real. This was a man of flesh and blood, a man who could have claimed his rights the moment she stepped off that coach, who could have dragged her into this house and reminded her of the contract she had agreed to. Instead, he offered her a key and an escape from the obligation. For months, she had lived in a state of constant vigilance, every instinct honed to detect danger. She had felt the predatory eyes of men on her in boarding houses, on trains, in crowded city streets. She knew the feeling of being sized up, evaluated, hunted. She had learned to make herself small, to be unnoticeable, to move through the world like a ghost. But as she stood on this dusty patch of earth, looking at the man who had paid for her passage, she felt a subtle, seismic shift inside her. It was not trust. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, a muscle that had long since atrophied from disuse. It was something far more fundamental. She looked from Colt's shadowed face to the open doorway of the house. She took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of dust and dry juniper. Then, she picked up her valise, stepped onto the porch, and crossed his threshold. She did it not because she believed in his goodness, but because, for the first time in a very, very long time, she didn't feel like prey. The inside of the Merriweather house was a shock of order. After the blinding, chaotic expanse of the desert, the main room felt like a sanctuary. It was simple, built of timber that still bore the marks of the adze. The beams above dark and solid, but it was meticulously clean. The air didn't hold the stale scent of whiskey and unwashed bodies that clung to the town, but rather the sharp, clean bite of lye soap and the comforting, earthy smell of seasoned iron pans. From somewhere outside, the constant, rhythmic creak of the windmill provided a steady, metallic heartbeat. It was the sound of water, of life, and it was the only sound in the room. Colt gestured with his hat, which he now held in his hands. "Your room's here." He led her to a door just off the main living space. He didn't just point, he opened it for her, pushing the simple wooden door inward. The room was small, containing a sturdy-looking bed frame with a neatly folded quilt, a small washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a simple wooden chair. It was Spartan, but like the rest of the house, impeccably clean. "It ain't much," he said, his voice low, as if he were afraid of startling her. He stepped just inside, his boots hesitant on the threshold, and pointed to the door jamb. "There's a bolt. It fastens from in here." Lila's eyes fixed on the small, heavy piece of iron. It was new, the wood around it freshly carved, the metal dark and oiled. It was a simple mechanism, but in that moment, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was a statement. He had installed it for her. "The window," he added, gesturing. "It faces the corral. No one comes up that way without the horses making a fuss." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He seemed to take this as all the answer he needed. "The necessary is out back, to the left. I'll be in the barn for a spell. Holler if you need well." He just nodded again. A short, final gesture. And then he backed out of the room, pulling the door almost closed, leaving it open just a crack. Another offering of choice. She heard his footsteps move away, the front door open, and then the sound of his boots on the hard-packed earth outside. Only then did she move. She stepped inside her room and pushed the door shut, the snick of the latch seeming to echo in the profound silence. Her fingers found the iron bolt and slid it home. The solid thunk of the bolt seating in its catch was the first true breath she'd taken in a year. She did not unpack. She did not remove her dress or her gloves. She sat on the edge of the bed, her boots still on, her valise on the floor beside her where she could reach it. Her unopened notebook lay on her lap. A silent confessor. She sat as still as a rabbit in a thicket, and she listened. She mapped the house in her head. The groan of a floorboard in the main room as the evening chill set in. The pop and tick of the kitchen stove as the fire he had banked for the night began to cool. And always, the metronomic creak groan of the windmill, a sleepless guardian outside her window. The house was alive, and she was learning its language, cataloging every sigh and whisper. Night fell completely. The square of her window turned from dusty gold to a deep, bruised purple, and finally to a pale, milky white as the moon climbed over the corral fence. The light etched the rails in silver and shadow. She watched a lone horse, a dark shape, moving restlessly by the water trough. She must have dozed, still sitting upright, her body rigid with exhaustion and fear. What woke her was a change in the wind. The windmill's rhythm broke, the vanes clattering in a sudden gust. And then, a sound that froze the blood in her veins. A latch stirred, not her latch, but the latch to the front door. Fear, cold and sharp, spiked through her. It was a physical jolt, visceral and sickening. He's coming back. It was a lie. It was all a lie. Her eyes darted around the moonlit room, searching for a weapon. Her valise. Too clumsy. The chair. Too large. Her gaze landed on the washstand. Beside the pitcher sat a small, heavy brass inkwell. Her hand closed around it, the metal cold and solid against her palm. She rose from the bed, silent as a shadow, and moved to the side of her door, pressing her back flat against the wall. She held the inkwell raised, her knuckles white, her breath trapped in her chest. She heard a single, slow footstep on the floor of the main room, then another, stopping right outside her door. The silence stretched, pulled taut as a wire. She could hear her own heart, a frantic drum against her ribs. Then the lightest, faintest tap-tap on the wood. She didn't breathe. The door handle turned, slowly. She watched, her arm tensing. As the door opened, it didn't swing wide. It opened only a hand's breadth, just enough for a dark gap to appear. A hand, large and rough, appeared in the gap. It held something folded, something dark. The hand placed the object on the floor, just inside her threshold. Then it was gone. The door clicked shut. The latch was not tried. She waited, her heart hammering. For a full minute, she heard the sound of his footsteps again, moving away. The front door opened and closed. Her legs were shaking so hard she had to lean against the wall. Slowly, cautiously. She unbolted the door and peered out. The main room was empty, lit only by the faint moonlight from the windows. On the floor, just inside her room, lay a folded shawl. It was thick wool, simply woven, but clean. She picked it up. It was heavy, and it still held a faint warmth, as if it had been hanging by the stove. The night chill was indeed setting in. The floorboards were cold beneath her boots. He had come back not to take, but to give. She bolted the door again, the sound softer this time, less desperate. She sat on the bed, the heavy shawl across her lap. Only then did she finally open the slim leather notebook. She uncapped the inkwell, dipped the pen, and in the sliver of moonlight from the window, she wrote one measured line, her script precise and controlled. He did not cross the room. He left warmth and went away. She slept, then, a hard, dreamless sleep, fully clothed, the inkwell on the chair beside her and the shawl clutched in her hand. Dawn came not with a sound, but with a change in the light, a slow graying of the window. She woke stiff and sore, Her first thought a disoriented panic, her hand flying to the empty space where the inkwell had been before she remembered she had moved it. Then she heard the sounds of the ranch, the clang of a bucket, the nicker of a horse, the distant, muffled sound of a man clearing his throat. She waited. She heard him moving outside, his steps fading toward the barn. Carefully, she unbolted her door and opened it. The house was empty, but on the floor, just outside her threshold, was a tin mug of coffee, steam still rising in a fragile wisp. Beside it sat a plate with a thick slice of cornbread, wrapped carefully in a clean cloth to keep it soft and warm. She brought the offerings into her room, bolting the door behind her. She drank the coffee. It was scalding hot, black, and punishingly strong. But it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. The cornbread was dense and filling, and the cloth it was wrapped in smelled of lye soap, not of him. An hour later, she emerged. She had washed her face in the cold water from the pitcher and combed her hair, repinning it tightly. She found Colt in the yard, his back to her, standing in the bright, unforgiving morning light. He wasn't tending to the horses or the windmill. He was oiling a rifle. She stopped on the porch, her hand gripping the rail. It was a Henry rifle, its brass receiver gleaming dully. He was working a soft cloth along the barrel, his movements economical and completely assured. There was no menace in the action. It was not a display. It was a chore, as mundane as sharpening a scythe or mending a harness. The tempo was careful, practiced, unshowy. He treated the weapon with the same detached respect he seemed to treat everything as a tool necessary for survival in this place. He must have heard her, because he paused, though he didn't turn. "Coffee was on the stove," he said. "I found it. Thank you." Her voice was a dry rasp. He nodded, still not looking at her. He finished his task, carefully laid the rifle and the cloth aside on a clean piece of canvas, and then finally turned to face her. His gaze met hers directly, and it held. He looked at her face, at her eyes, and nowhere else. In her life, Lila had been subjected to every kind of look a man could give a woman: the hungry, the assessing, the dismissive, the cruel. She had been inventoried like livestock, her worth calculated in a single, sweeping glance from her hairline to her ankles. Colt Merriweather's gaze never dipped below her collarbone. He held her eyes with a respectful neutrality that was more profound than any kindness. He wasn't ignoring her. He was seeing her, the person, and deliberately refusing to assess her, the woman. Lila noticed the restraint more than she would have noticed hunger. It was a conscious choice, a wall he had built to make her feel safe, and it was stronger than any bolt. "The well runs low by September," he said abruptly, breaking the silence. He pointed not to the windmill, but to the deep, stone-lined well near the side of the house. "The mill pulls from the deep aquifer, but this one gets shallow. We have to be mindful." He walked over to it, picked up the bucket, and gestured to the cistern she had passed yesterday. "Every drop that goes in there is counted, every cup we drink." He wasn't complaining. He was stating a fact, the primary rule of the territory. He was initiating her into the reality of their partnership. This wasn't about contracts or expectations. It was about water. He looked up at the vast, empty blue of the sky, a sky that held the promise of heat but not relief. His expression was one she recognized from the daguerreotype of her mother, the weary, patient look of someone locked in a long, slow bargain with God. He pointed to the sky, a simple, almost hopeless gesture. It was a prayer. Lila stood on the porch, the empty tin mug in her hand. She watched this quiet, contained man who spoke of rifles and water with the same level of care, who offered blankets without showing his face, and who policed his own gaze as strictly as a sentinel. Something inside her, a knot that had been pulling tighter for months, a thing that had been wound so tight it had become a permanent part of her, did not unravel. It did not break, but it loosened. It was not trust. Trust was a house built brick by brick, and she didn't even have the straw for the first one. It was something else. It was, she realized, permission to breathe. The air in her lungs felt like her own. For 3 days, a quiet, fragile rhythm established itself. It was a language spoken in gestures. Colt would leave coffee and a portion of whatever he was eating cornbread. A strip of jerky by her door before dawn. She would, hours later, leave the clean-washed tin mug and plate in the same spot. He never approached her room. She never ventured far from the house. He spent his days mending tack in the shade of the barn or riding the perimeter of his small property, his figure a dark, distant shape against the skyline. She spent her days inside, her door bolted, reading the same 3 books she'd packed, or simply sitting by the window, watching the heat ripple off the corral. On the 4th morning, the routine broke. She emerged from her room as he was at the stove, his back to her. The smell of coffee was thick in the air. "Ma'am," he said, not turning. "There's a plate." "Mr. Merriweather," she began, her voice small. He turned, his gaze as careful as ever, resting on her face. I cannot stay inside this room forever. I must contribute." He considered this. "There's work." "I know, but we are low on flour and beans." She had done a quiet inventory of the larder. It was a house run by a man alone, stocked with necessities but running low. He nodded slowly. "I'll ride in this afternoon." "No," she said, surprising herself with the strength of the word. "Let me. I can do this." It was a test, not of him, but of herself. Could she exist in the world again? For a long moment, he was silent. He looked at her, truly looked, and she saw the calculation in his eyes. He was weighing her request against her visible fragility. Finally, he turned, retrieved a small, worn leather coin pouch from a hook by the door, and held it out to her. He also produced a small, folded piece of paper. "My list," he said. "Flour, beans, salt, coffee, and cartridges for the Henry. If they have 'em. .38 rimfire, misses. Hode at the Mercantile knows what I use." He placed the pouch and the list on the table between them, a gesture of trust so profound it almost made her sick with anxiety. "The bay mare, Jenny, is in the corral. She's saddle-broke and gentle, or you can take the buckboard, if you prefer." "The mare is fine," she whispered, taking the pouch. The coins inside felt impossibly heavy. An hour later, she was riding down Sage Fork Road, the dust pluming behind her. The short ride was a sensory assault. The sun was a hammer, the sky a vacant, aching blue. Every sound the jingle of the harness, the cry of a hawk, the distant, steady creak of their own windmill falling behind her seemed amplified, scraping against her raw nerves. Mercy Street was busier than it had been on her arrival. 2 wagons were tethered outside the saloon, and a few ranch hands loitered on the porch of the Mercantile. As Lila dismounted, tying Jenny to the hitching rail, she felt their eyes on her. It was the same silent, assessing gaze of the town, but this time it felt different. It was curious, but not, she noted, overtly hostile. She was Colt Merriweather's woman. That title, it seemed, afforded her a thin, brittle armor of respect. She kept her head down, clutching the coin pouch, and pushed her way into the Mercy Street Mercantile. The interior was a sudden, cool gloom, smelling of coffee beans, cured leather, bolt cloth, and sharp cheddar. A small, round woman with kind eyes and graying hair pinned in a tight bun looked up from behind the counter. "Mornin'," the woman said pleasantly. "Can I help you?" "I have a list for Mr. Merriweather," Lila said, her voice barely audible. "Ah, yes, Colt, good man." The woman, who must be Mrs. Hode, smiled. "He doesn't come in nearly enough." She took the list, her eyes scanning it. Flour, beans, salt, coffee, oh, and his cartridges. "I have everything but the salt. Expecting a shipment on the next wagon, maybe Thursday. Will that do?" Yes, Lila nodded, her eyes darting around the store. It was packed floor to ceiling with goods, tins of peaches, sacks of grain, tools, hats, and a small glass case with ribbons and buttons. She felt a sudden, strange longing. It was so normal, so utterly, painfully normal. I'll just get those cartridges from the back. Mrs., Hode said. Help yourself to a look round. We just got in some lovely new yardage from St. Louis. Left alone, Lila allowed herself to breathe. She moved slowly down an aisle, her fingers tracing the rough texture of a sack of pinto beans. She stopped at a shelf of tinned goods. Her list was almost complete. There was just one more thing she needed, for herself. Tea. She reached for a small, brightly painted tin of black tea. And then she heard it. It was not a real sound. It was a memory, a ghost of a sound that slid down her spine like ice water. It was a voice, oily and intimate, thick with false piety, a lost lamb, sister, but the Lord provides a shepherd for his flock. Lila froze, her hand hovering over the tin. Her blood ran cold. It was his voice, the voice of Braxley preacher Darlin. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide, scanning the dim corners of the store. He was not there. The store was empty save for her. She was safe. It was just a memory, a phantom. She let out a shaky breath, trying to calm the sudden, violent tremor in her hands. She turned to go back to the counter, and her gaze fell on the town notice board, nailed to a thick support post near the door. It was covered in handbills, a reward for a lost bull, a notice of a town meeting, a price list for the blacksmith, and in the very center, nailed with a single, dark roofing nail, was a small, square card. It was stark white. On it, printed in bold black ink, was a simple, chilling emblem, a black cross laid over a sheaf of wheat. His calling card. He was here, or he had been. He was in Cinder Mesa, or he was close, passing through, his shadow falling across this valley, this town, this one small street. The air in the Mercantile, moments ago so cool and safe, suddenly became thick, suffocating. She couldn't breathe. The walls of the store seemed to be closing in, the towering shelves leaning over her. The smell of coffee and leather turned sour, coating the back of her throat. Panic, absolute and blinding, seized her. Her vision narrowed to a tiny, dark tunnel. The only thing she could see was the black cross, the symbol of her salvation, the emblem of the man who placed desperate women, the ones running from abusive husbands or ruined pasts, finding them shelter, finding them work, and then selling them like chattel to saloon owners, brothel keepers, or lonely, cruel men in remote territories. He had promised shelter and delivered cages. Here we are, dear, 1 box of O. Mrs. Hode had returned, holding the small box of cartridges. Lila, startled by the voice, jumped, her body reacting before her mind could. Her trembling hand, the one that had been reaching for the tea, spasmed. The tin slipped from her grasp and crashed to the floor, spilling dark leaves across the dusty floorboards. "Oh my," Lila whispered, the words tearing from her raw throat. No matter at all. "Mrs." Hode said, her voice full of concern. She bent down, her hand reaching out to pat Lila's arm in a gesture of comfort. "It's just a bit of tea, child. Don't you fret." But as the woman's hand, warm and fleshy, came toward her, Lila flinched. She didn't just move, she recoiled, scrambling backward with a small, choked cry, as if Mrs. Hode's hand were a hot iron, a snake, a fist. The storekeeper's wife froze, her hand still in the air, her face a mask of shock and pity. "Dear child." But Lila was gone. The coin pouch and the list were still on the counter. The spilled tea was a dark stain on the floor. She didn't care. She turned and fled, bursting through the doors of the Mercantile into the blinding, hostile sunlight. She ran, her breath tearing in ragged sobs. her boots striking the wooden stairs of the porch with a hollow, frantic sound. She didn't hear the men on the saloon porch call out. She didn't see the wagon driver who had to pull his team up short to avoid her. She fumbled with Jenny's reins, her hands useless, shaking so badly she could barely unloop them from the rail. She jammed her boot into the stirrup, hauled herself into the saddle, and wheeled the mare in a frantic, stumbling circle, kicking its flanks hard. She fled back down Sage Fork Road, riding not with purpose, but with the mindless, desperate terror of an animal escaping a trap. Colt found the mare an hour later. Jenny was standing at the corral gate, her coat dark with sweat, her sides heaving. The reins were tangled around her forelegs, a sign of a rider who had dismounted in a blind panic and simply let them fall. He untangled the reins, his movement slow and deliberate, his face grim. He ran a hand down the mare's trembling leg, his touch gentle, calming. He had seen horses in this state before. It was the state of an animal that had absorbed the terror of its rider. He led the mare into the barn, unsaddled her, and began to rub her down. His mind working. He thought of the list, the money. He thought of the town. He thought, briefly, of riding in and demanding answers from Mrs. Hode. But he knew, with a certainty that settled in his gut like a cold stone, that the answer was not in the town. It was in the house. It was behind a bolted door. He finished with the mare, his actions methodical, giving his anger time to cool and settle into something harder, something more patient. Then he walked to the house. He stopped outside her door. He did not knock. He did not call her name. He stood there, his hat in his hand, and he listened. At first, there was nothing, a silence so profound it felt louder than a scream. And then he heard it, a small, rhythmic sound, like a tiny animal in distress, a hiccup, a choked-off sob, the sound of someone trying to cry without making a noise. He closed his eyes for a second. The sound cut him deeper than a knife. He knew, then, that whatever had happened, it was not the town. It was the past. The past had reached into Cinder Mesa and grabbed her. He turned and walked away from the door. He went to the kitchen, ladled a bowl of the stew he had simmering on the stove, tore a thick heel from a loaf of bread, and poured a fresh cup of water. He placed it all on a clean cloth, carried it to her door, and set it on the floor. "Lila," he said, his voice quiet but clear, pitched to carry through the wood. "There's food here, when you're ready." He didn't wait for an answer. He went to the front porch, retrieved the simple, spindle-backed rocking chair, and carried it back into the hall. He placed it against the wall, opposite her door. Then he went and got his Henry rifle. He sat. He balanced the rifle loose across his thighs, his eyes on the hallway, on the space between his house and her room, and he took up the watch. The sun set, and the house grew dark. The night chill crept in. The windmill moaned, and Colt Merriweather sat, unmoving, a guardian in the shadows. Lila, huddled on her bed, her knees drawn to her chest, heard him. She heard the scrape of the chair. She heard the muffled sounds of the food being set down. She heard, through the wood, the almost imperceptible sound of a man breathing. At midnight, the fear had subsided, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. The bolted door, which had felt like a trap in her panic, now felt like the only solid thing in the world. She crept from the bed and parted the thin curtain of her window, the one that faced the corral. Her gaze, however, was drawn to the moonlight spilling onto the front porch. She could see him, through her window, and the window in the main room. She could see a sliver of the hall. He was still there. He hadn't gone to his own bed. He was sitting in that hard-backed chair, the moonlight catching the brass receiver of the rifle on his lap. He wasn't sleeping. His head was up, his eyes open, staring not at her door, but at the in-between spaces, the dark hallway, the front door. He was watching. Not her. He was watching for her. A strange, painful knot formed in her throat. She went back to the bed, pulled out her notebook, and uncapped the ink. In the shaky moonlight, she wrote 2 lines. "He stayed. That is a sentence I do not know how to hold." The next morning, she unbolted the door. The food was cold, untouched, but she carried it into her room. He was gone from the chair. She heard him at the stove. She took a breath, held it, and stepped out. He was pouring coffee, his back to her. He didn't turn, but his shoulders were tense. "He was a pastor," Lila said. The words came out in a dry croak. Colt froze, the coffee pot hovering. "His name is Braxley Darlin. He calls himself preacher." She was speaking to his back, her eyes fixed on the grain of the wooden table. He finds women who are in need, women with no one. He promises shelter, a new life, a placement with a good family. She finally had to take a breath. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the drip of coffee onto the hot stove. "He promised shelter," she whispered, the words finally breaking free. "And he delivered cages." Colt set the coffee pot down, his movements dangerously slow. He said nothing for a long time. He did not turn. He just stood there, his hands braced on the edge of the stove, his back a rigid wall of muscle. The silence stretched, becoming a tangible thing, heavy and electric with unspoken violence. Lila wanted to shrink back into her room, to bolt the door, terrified of the stillness she had created. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud. It was terrifyingly quiet, a low, flat rumble that seemed to come from the stones of the earth. "He won't get within a mile of this ranch, not if I can help it." He turned, then, and his eyes met hers. They were not the pale, rainless gray she remembered. They were darker, like stone, and they held a promise that was as absolute and unforgiving as the desert itself. Lila looked at him, and her body was torn in two. The old, conditioned fear screamed at her to run, to hide, to never trust a promise from any man, especially not a promise of protection. But the sight of him, the exhaustion etched around his eyes from his night-long vigil, the hard certainty in his voice sparked something new, a tiny, fragile, and agonizingly painful ember of hope. She stood there, rattled and shaking, caught between the ghost of the man who sold her and the reality of the man who stood guard. In her chest, fear and hope began to grind against each other, 2 heavy mill gears, threatening to tear her apart. After the confession, the silence in the house changed. It was no longer the tense, brittle silence of 2 strangers navigating a shared cage. It became something else, something with texture and weight, like a heavy blanket. It was a silence of acknowledgement. He did not press her for details. He did not offer platitudes or hollow promises. He had made his one stark vow, and now he seemed content to let the space between them fill with the mundane rhythms of the ranch. He was giving her time to heal, and he was doing it the only way he knew how, by getting on with the work. Lila began to watch him. At first, it was a continuation of her old habit of survival, cataloging the movements of a potentially dangerous male. But slowly, her observation shifted. She was no longer just watching for threats. She was simply watching the man. She learned the set of his shoulders when he was tired, the way he would test the wind with a wet finger before starting a task, the quiet, efficient economy of his every movement. He wasted nothing, not a word, not a gesture, not a drop of water. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the mesas in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, she saw him walking not toward their own ranch, but toward the neighboring property. It belonged to the widow Caraway, a woman whose husband had been taken by a fever 2 winters back. Lila watched from her window as Colt stopped at the widow's fence line, a section that was sagging and broken. He hadn't brought a horse. He'd carried a post-hole digger, a mallet, and a roll of wire on his own broad back. He worked in the fading light, alone, the rhythmic thump of the mallet carrying on the still evening air. No one had asked him to be there. The widow was in town, visiting her sister. There was no audience, no one to offer thanks or payment. There was only the man, the broken fence, and the encroaching dark. He worked until he was a mere silhouette against the twilight. And then he gathered his tools and walked home, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust that looked like departing ghosts in the moonlight. Lila stayed at her window long after he had gone, the sound of the mallet echoing in her mind. A few days later, she saw him hitch the buckboard and load it not with supplies, but with 4 large, sloshing water barrels from their own cistern. He drove the wagon toward the small adobe building that served as the town's schoolhouse. Lila, driven by a curiosity that was beginning to outweigh her fear, saddled the gentle mare, Jenny, and followed at a distance. She watched from a rise as he hauled the heavy buckets, one by one, to the small, parched garden behind the schoolhouse. It was the private garden of the schoolmarm, Elsie Pike, a spinster from back east who was trying, against all logic, to grow roses and tomatoes in the unforgiving New Mexico soil. He moved with a steady, relentless pace, his shirt soaked with sweat and spilled water. He emptied every barrel, turning the cracked earth of Miss Pike's garden into a dark, hopeful mud. When he was finished, he didn't knock on the schoolmarm's door. He didn't wait for the effusive thanks she would surely have given him. He simply loaded the empty buckets back onto the buckboard and drove away, leaving behind the gift of water like a secret answered prayer. The most telling incident happened the following week. A boy from town rode out to the ranch in a lather, saying a pronghorn antelope had been caught in a new stretch of barbed wire up near Hawks Point. It was a slow, cruel way to die. Colt didn't hesitate. He took a pair of wire cutters and rode out. Lila, again, felt compelled to follow, staying far enough back not to be seen. She watched from a rocky outcrop as he approached the terrified animal. The pronghorn thrashed, its delicate legs already torn and bleeding, the barbs digging deeper with every panicked movement. Colt didn't rush. He dismounted and spoke to it, his voice a low, steady murmur, the same tone he used to soothe a spooked horse. He moved slowly, deliberately, until he was close enough to use the cutters. With 2 sharp snips, the wire sprang free. The pronghorn, stunned by its sudden liberty, stood trembling for a second. Then it bolted, bounding away across the scrubland, its white rump patch flashing like a flag of surrender and gratitude. Colt watched it go. Then he coiled the dangerous, cut wire and tied it to his saddle to be disposed of properly. He had ridden 5 miles under a hot sun not just to free an animal, but to clean up the mess that had trapped it. When she finally ventured back into town with him for supplies, this time sitting beside him on the buckboard, a silent and tense passenger, she heard Mrs. Hode at the Mercantile ask him about the fence and the water. "Colt Merriweather, you do more for this town than any 3 men," the woman said, shaking her head in fond exasperation. "Why do you do it?" Colt, who was inspecting the handle of a new axe, just shrugged, not looking up. "Idle hands make loud ghosts," he said, and that was all. The phrase stuck with Lila. It was an epitaph for a past he never spoke of. It was the key to his restless, quiet acts of mercy. He wasn't building credit or seeking salvation in the eyes of his neighbors. He was simply trying to outwork the phantoms that haunted him. That night, she wrote in her notebook, her hand steady, "You watched a man choose quiet mercy over witness." The next morning, she made a decision. She spent the day in the kitchen, using the last of the sugar in a basket of tart, wild quince she had found growing near the well. She boiled and stirred, the sweet, fragrant steam filling the small house. By evening, she had a single, perfect jar of shimmering, amber-colored quince preserves. She tied a bit of spare ribbon, salvaged from her valise, around the lid. After Colt had gone to the barn for his evening chores, she placed the jar in the very center of the kitchen table. When he came in for supper, he saw it immediately. She watched him from the corner of her eye. His gaze fell on the jar, lingered for a half-second, and then moved on as if it weren't there. He ate his meal of beans and bread in their usual silence. But when he was finished, He took the jar, opened it, and spooned a generous amount onto his last piece of bread. He ate it slowly, his eyes closed for a brief moment, and when he was done, he simply said, "Good preserves." He didn't ask where it came from. He didn't thank her directly. He pretended it was just a normal part of their larder, a thing that had always been there, and in doing so, he accepted her offering without burdening it with the weight of gratitude, allowing her a small, anonymous victory. Their shared existence began to soften at the edges. One sweltering noon, when the sun was too high and hot for work, they shared a meal of bread and cheese in the sliver of shade cast by the barn. They didn't talk much. He pointed out a hawk circling high above. She mentioned that the gray mare seemed to be favoring her left foreleg. The conversation was functional, sparse, but the silence between the words was no longer empty. It was comfortable, as essential and life-giving as the shade they sat in. It was a comfort, like water. He began to teach her the ranch. He showed her how to read the sky for the hint of rain, how to tell good grazing from bad. He took her to the windmill and made her listen. "Hear that," he'd say. "That low, even hum that's healthy. That's the sound of water coming up." A week later, he'd have her listen again. "Hear that little tick, that high-pitched whine, that's a bearing starting to go. We'll have to pull it and grease it come Sunday." He was teaching her the language of their survival, making her a partner in the lifeblood of the ranch. In return, she began to claim her own space within their partnership. She took over the mending. One evening, by the light of the kerosene lamp, she patched a tear in the cuff of his work shirt. The small, sharp needle in her hand moved with a steady, practiced rhythm. In, out, in, out. The sound it made in the quiet room, the gentle pull of thread through worn chambray, sounded like mended breathing. It felt like her own. The next time he came back from town, he left a package on the kitchen table. Inside was a pair of work gloves. They were made of soft, supple deerskin, well-oiled and new. They were small, her size. He had bought them for her, without comment, without presentation. It was a silent acknowledgement that her hands, too, were part of the work of this place now. That weekend, while he was greasing the windmill bearing, Lila took a shovel and dug 3 holes behind the porch, in the stubborn, powdered soil, from a sheltered spot by the well. She carefully transplanted 3 young, spiky white yucca plants. They were her mother's favorite flower, a plant that bloomed defiantly in the harshest of conditions, its tall, proud stalk of white blossoms a testament to its stubborn roots. As she packed the dry soil around the base of the plants, she felt it, the feeling of planting a part of herself in this hard, unforgiving ground. A kind of peace settled over the ranch, as gentle as the evening cool. It was a fragile thing, easily broken, but it was real, and one afternoon, it was broken, not by violence or fear, but by a goat. A stray billy goat, a scruffy, bearded creature with a malevolent yellow eye, had taken to wandering onto the property. Colt tolerated it with a weary resignation. On this particular afternoon, Colt had taken off his hat, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. He'd set the hat on a fence post. The goat, with a speed that belied its shambling gait, trotted over, snatched the hat in its teeth, and began to chew on the brim with a thoughtful, grinding motion. Colt just stood there, watching, his hands on his hips. He looked at the goat, looked at the sky, and sighed, a long-suffering sound of a man who had made his peace with the world's small absurdities. He wore the dust in his hair and on his face like he meant it, a crown of honest labor. And from the porch, a sound escaped Lila that neither of them had ever heard before. It wasn't a word or a gasp. It was a skitter of sound, a small, breathy burst that was rusty from disuse. It was laughter. It surprised her as much as it did him. Her hand flew to her mouth, as if to trap it, but it was too late. Colt turned, his expression of weary annoyance shifting to one of sheer, unadulterated surprise. He wasn't looking at the goat anymore. He was looking at her, at the smile she couldn't quite contain, at the light in her eyes. And for the first time since she had arrived in Cinder Mesa, a real, genuine smile touched Colt Merriweather's lips. It reached his pale, rainless eyes, and for a fleeting moment, they looked like the sky after a long, soaking storm. The laughter had faded, but its echo remained. It had changed the air in the small, hand-hewn house, smoothing the rough edges of their silence. Lila found herself leaving her door unbolted more often than not. She had taken to using the main room as her own, sitting not in her shadowy bedroom, but on the braided rug before the hearth, using the firelight to write in her leather notebook. The house had begun to feel less like a fortress and more like a shelter. One evening, the smell of a slow simmering stew filled the room, thick with onion and the wild herbs she'd gathered. A sudden gust of wind down the chimney scattered a few sparks, and Lila set her notebook down on the hearthstone's open, to mark her place, and rose to tend the fire. She heard the horses nicker in the corral, a sign that Colt was finished with the evening chores. She turned, wiping her hands on her apron, ready to set the table. Colt came in, brushing the trail dust from his hat. He moved with a weariness that went bone deep. The house was warm, the air filled with the scent of her cooking. It was a scene of domesticity so potent it almost stopped him at the threshold. He walked toward the stove, unfastening the cuffs of his shirt, and that's when he saw it. Her notebook. It lay on the hearth, face up, the firelight illuminating her neat, precise script. His first instinct was to look away. It was her private place, the one part of her world he had no right to. He would never have read it. But as he passed, his own movement stirred the air, and the page, warmed by the fire, lifted and settled, revealing a line written near the top. He stopped, his gaze caught unwillingly. He didn't mean to read it, but the words were stark, leaping out at him from the page. I came to escape, not to love. The words were a physical blow, a sudden, cold fist to the gut. He stood frozen, reading the line again. To escape, not to love. He thought of the laughter by the corral, a sound he had replayed in his mind a dozen times. He thought of the quince preserves, the jar now half empty on the shelf. He thought of the mended cuff of the very shirt he was wearing, the stitches small and careful. He had mistaken those things. He had mistaken the mended breathing for something else. This line, written in the privacy of her soul, was the truth. He was a locked door. He was a safe distance. He was the man who kept watch. He was a function, not a man. The words found bone. He felt a coldness creep into his chest, a familiar emptiness he hadn't realized he'd lost. With a gentleness that was almost painful, he reached down, his calloused fingers careful not to smudge the ink, and closed the notebook. He placed it squarely on the mantel, a sign that it had been seen and closed. Smells good, he said, his voice a low rasp, not turning to look at her. It's ready, she said, sensing the immediate, inexplicable shift in him. The warmth he usually brought in from the yard was gone, replaced by a sudden, sterile chill. He didn't move toward the table. He walked to the basin, washed his hands, the sound of the water splashing loud in the sudden quiet. Then he dried them, put his hat back on, and walked to the front door. Colt. Not hungry, he said, his hand on the latch. I'll be on the porch. He didn't wait for a reply. He took the rocking chair from its spot, the one he had used to stand guard outside her door, and moved it outside. Lila stood, motionless, her hand still holding the ladle. She watched him walk onto the porch, set the chair down facing not the house, but the black, empty horizon, and sit. The silence that fell was profound. It was not the comfortable silence of their shared meals. This was a hollow, aching void. She ate her stew alone, the food tasting like ash. The house, which had felt so full and safe moments before, now felt vast and cold. Later, She noticed he hadn't come in to bank the fire or check the latches. His nightly rituals, the small, unspoken gestures that signaled the house was secure and the day was done, were absent. He was still out there, a rigid silhouette against the rising moon, a sentinel once more. But this time, he was guarding against her. She retreated to her room, but the quiet ached like a bruise. She slid the bolt home, the sound echoing the failure she felt. She hadn't understood what had happened, only that she had, in some unknowable way, undone all the fragile progress they had made. She slept fitfully and woke before dawn to a house that was still and cold. The kitchen was empty. He was already in the barn, the metallic clang of the pump handle a sharp, lonely sound in the morning air. He was avoiding her. He was avoiding the house. When he finally came in, he carried the chill of the morning with him. He didn't meet her eyes. He just moved to the stove, his shoulders set in a hard, defensive line. Lila's hands were shaking. This silence was unbearable. She had to do something, to offer some small piece of the old routine. She moved to the stove, took the pot, and made the coffee. She made it just the way he favored, the way she had learned from watching him strong enough to float an egg, with a tiny pinch of salt to cut the bitterness. She poured a mug, and her heart hammering, set it on the table at his elbow. He stopped, his hand halfway to the water basin. He looked at the mug. He sat down, slowly, and wrapped his hands around its warmth. He took a sip. "My thanks," he said, his voice flat. He drank, staring at the wood grain of the table, and Lila, her eyes scanning the room for anything that was out of place, saw it, the notebook. It was on the mantel, not on the hearth. It was closed. Her breath caught. He hadn't just seen it. He had moved it. She looked at his broad, unforgiving back. She looked at the notebook, and she knew. He had read the line. He had read her past, her fear, and he had mistaken it for her present. This coldness was not anger. It was a profound, respectful retreat. He was honoring what he believed were her wishes. He was escaping, just as she had. The old panic surged, telling her to run, to bolt the door, to let the silence win. But the image of him mending the widow's fence, of his rifle across his lap, of his quiet, patient goodness, rose stronger. She walked to the mantel. He tensed, watching her. She picked up the notebook. She brought it back to the table, opened it, and uncapped the inkwell. He watched her every move, his pale eyes wary. She found the line he had read. "I came to escape, not to love." Her hand, holding the pen, was trembling so hard she could barely form the letters. But she dipped the pen and, on the line directly beneath it, she wrote, "But now I see the shape of what waits when I'm not afraid to look." She did not close the book. She turned it and slid it across the table to him, her fingers brushing his sleeve. It was an offering, a surrender, a truce flag made of paper. He looked from her face to the open page. His eyes scanned the first line, and his jaw tightened. Then he read the new one. Lila watched as a breath he seemed to have been holding for 12 hours unhooked itself from that tight, hard place between his ribs. It was a quiet, shuddering exhale, a release of tension so profound it seemed to make him smaller, less of a statue and more of a man. He raised his eyes from the page and met hers. The cold stone was gone, replaced by a raw, questioning vulnerability she had never seen. He said nothing. He just nodded once, slowly, and picked up his coffee mug. He stood and walked to the front door. He pushed it open, letting the cool, clean morning light spill in. He stood on the threshold, looking out, and then he looked back at her. It was an invitation. She followed. They stood on the porch, the new sun just beginning to warm the planks beneath their feet. The silence returned, but it was different again. It was the silence of a held breath, of a question asked and answered. Colt took a sip of his coffee, his gaze on the juniper trees. their shadows stretching long and blue. "We can move at your pace," he said, his voice low, still rough from the night. He glanced at her, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "Mine's too stubborn anyway." It was an absolution. It was a promise. He was giving the power back to her, and in the same breath, admitting his own stake. Lila looked at his profile, at the hard line of his jaw and the gentle way he held the mug. She thought of the bolt on her door, and the rifle on his lap, and the 2 lines in her book. They were 2 halves of the same truth. She took a small step, closing the distance between them. Then another. She inched closer on the porch step until her shoulder, covered in the simple calico of her dress, brushed the sleeve of his mended shirt. The contact was instantaneous, a quiet jolt. It was not the violent, shocking crack of lightning. It was the electricity of a low, steady current, a hum that traveled from his body to hers, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. It was the feeling of 2 solitary things suddenly, finally, touching. She didn't pull away. He didn't move. They just stood there. Side by side, their shoulders pressed together, a new, unbroken line. The wind spilled through the skeletal juniper, carrying the scent of dust and pine. High above, a hawk wheeled on an unseen current, its cry a sharp, lonely thread in the vast blue. Time itself seemed to slow, widening to hold the moment, and in the quiet, Lila could hear their breaths sink, inhale and exhale, a shared rhythm. There was no kiss. It wasn't time for that. A kiss was a roof, and they were still setting the foundation. This choice to stand together was the first post, the first beam. A promise was building its house between them. And in the hard light of the New Mexico morning, they both chose, on purpose, to be patient. That choice, more than any other, felt like courage, the fragile peace, born from laughter and built on shared silence. Lasted for 2 weeks. It was a time of quiet industry, of mended tack and newly planted yucca, of a house slowly becoming a home, but the peace of the territory was a shallow-rooted thing. And the first sign of trouble came, as it always did, with the cattle. It began as a whisper, a discrepancy in a head count. A rancher north of Cinder Mesa, a man named Henderson, was short 5 head. A week later, another rancher to the east was missing 10. The losses were small enough to be dismissed as straying or predation. But Colt Merriweather, whose own small herd grazed the scrubland along Turnstone Wash, knew better. He rode out at dawn, his face set in grim lines, and spent the day reading the land. What he found was troubling. He found tracks, but they were expertly scuffed and blurred. He found the remains of a campfire where the rustlers had altered the brands on the stolen cattle. The work was crude, done in haste, the new brands half-burned and ugly, designed only to confuse a buyer at a distant stockyard. Most disturbing of all, in a place where Henderson's cattle had been driven through a narrow pass. The trail had been salted. The rustlers had scattered rock salt across the tracks, a trick to draw other animals and obliterate the signs of their passage. This wasn't the work of desperate opportunists. This was organized, patient, and clever. The valley was being quietly bled. The unease settled over Cinder Mesa like a low-grade fever. Men gathered in the saloon in hushed groups, and the click of the telegraph key seemed to carry a new urgency. It was during this time that Colt received a visitor. Deputy Shaw Ringley rode out to the ranch, his horse a fine-looking sorrel, his saddle gleaming with polished silver conchos. Ringley was a widower, a man who wore his piety like a badge and his authority like a club. He had a thin, disapproving mouth and eyes that seemed to be constantly judging the moral failings of others. He found Colt reinforcing a corral post, the sleeves of his shirt rolled up to reveal corded, sun-browned forearms. Lila was on the porch, shaking out a braided rug, and she stilled at the sight of the lawman, her hands tightening on the fabric. "Merriweather," Ringley said, not dismounting, his voice carrying the sanctimonious tone of a courtroom pronouncement. A word. Colt didn't stop his work, driving a nail home with 2 clean, powerful strokes. Ringley. There's talk in town, the deputy continued, his gaze flicking to Lila on the porch and then quickly away, as if her presence were an indecency. About the rustling, and about other things. Colt straightened up slowly, his pale eyes narrowing. If you have something to say, say it. A man in your position, a man with a new bride, Ringley said, loading the words with insinuation, needs to be mindful. People are on edge. A woman's reputation, especially one who arrives by stagecoach with no family to speak for her, is a delicate thing. It would be a shame if her past were to cause folks to look at you with suspicion. The threat was veiled, but unmistakable. Lila felt a cold dread creep up her spine. He was talking about her. He was using her as a lever against Colt. Colt laid his hammer down with deliberate care. He walked to the edge of the corral, his movements unnervingly calm. My wife's reputation is my concern, he said, his voice flat and dangerous. And my cattle are my concern. If you've come to do your job and help track rustlers, then get down off that horse. Otherwise, you're on my land, and you're wasting my time. A dull red flush crept up Ringley's neck. He had expected deference, not defiance. He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, venomous whisper, loud enough for only Colt and Lila, straining to hear from the porch to catch. Maybe you should be asking her who her friends are, he hissed. That preacher she was traveling with, the one with the revival tent, Braxley Durin. He's pitched his circus 2 valleys north, up by Angel's Notch. Funny how trouble seems to follow men like that, and the women they keep. Lila's heart stopped. Durin, he was that close. 2 valleys. She could almost feel his shadow stretching, reaching for her. The rug slipped from her numb fingers and fell to the porch in a dusty heap. Colt's face was a mask of stone. He stared at Ringley for a long, silent moment, and in that gaze was a promise of violence so pure that the deputy's horse, sensing it, shifted nervously. Get off my land, Shaw, Colt said, his voice barely a whisper. Ringley, his point made, reined his horse around and trotted away, leaving a cloud of dust and poison in his wake. That night, the psychological war began. A rider came in the dark. They didn't hear him, but in the morning, they found it. Lying just outside their front gate was the body of a newborn calf, its throat cut. Pinned to its hide with a skinning knife was a small, torn scrap of paper. It was a page from a hymn book. The truce of unspoken things was over. This was a message, direct and vile. It was Durin's language, the corruption of the innocent, the twisting of the sacred. 2 days later, the windmill began to scream. It wasn't the familiar, rhythmic groan of hard-working machinery. It was a high-pitched, metallic shriek of torture, a sound that grated on the nerves and set the teeth on edge. Colt, his face grim, spent the better part of the day taking the mechanism apart. He found the cause in the grease cups of the main bearings. Someone had forced a handful of coarse sand and grit into them. It was deliberate sabotage, designed to destroy the machine that was their lifeblood. The cistern, already low from the dry season, was now dropping to a dangerously low level. Water, their most precious commodity, was being used as a weapon against them. The final blow was not against them, but through them. The widow Caraway rode out to the ranch, her face pale with fear and outrage. Someone had broken into her pantry in the night. They hadn't stolen much aside of bacon, a few tins of peaches, but they had poured a bag of lye into her barrel of flour, poisoning it. It was an act of pure, calculated malice, and everyone knew Colt had been mending the widow's fences, helping her. The message was clear: anyone helped by Colt Merriweather would become a target. They were trying to isolate him, to turn the community he quietly served against him. That was the last straw. That afternoon, Colt packed a canteen and a strip of jerky. He saddled his horse, slid his Henry rifle into the scabbard, and turned to Lila. "I'm riding out," he said. "I'm going to find their trail." "It's too dangerous," she said, her voice tight with fear. "It's more dangerous to sit here and wait for them to poison our well or burn our house down." His jaw was set. "Bolt the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone." He rode toward the hills, and Lila was left with the screaming silence of the ranch and the ghosts of her past. But she did not retreat to her room. The woman who had fled the mercantile in a blind panic was gone, replaced by someone harder, someone who had been forged in the fire of Colt's quiet strength. She would not be a liability. She would not be a victim. She went to the main room and unrolled an old, cracked survey map of the territory that Colt kept in a wooden chest. For years, her survival had depended on noticing details, on understanding systems, on seeing the patterns in the behavior of her captors. Darlin ran his operation like a business, with supply lines, schedules, and networks. These rustlers, she was certain, were no different. She spent the next 2 days studying the map. She marked the locations of the ranches that had been hit. She noted the watering holes, the box canyons, the old, forgotten trails. She counted the hours it would take to drive cattle between 2 points, the time needed for watering, the patterns of the moon, and slowly, a design began to emerge. The rustlers weren't hitting at random. They were working their way south, along a specific line, always staying within a day's ride of a series of hidden canyons that led toward Rattlespur Gulch, a notorious maze of badlands where a small army could disappear. She saw the pattern, faint but clear, like stitches in a dark piece of cloth. Colt returned on the evening of the second day, covered in dust, his face etched with exhaustion and grim satisfaction. "I found it," he said, drinking deeply from the bucket she drew for him. "Drag marks from at least 20 head, all leading toward the mouth of Rattlespur. They're staging there, waiting until they have a big enough herd to drive south to the rail line." "I know," she said quietly. He looked at her, surprised. She led him inside and showed him the map, her finger tracing the faint pencil marks she had made. She explained her theory, the logic of the raids, the timeline, the probable route. He listened, his expression shifting from surprise to a deep, grudging respect. "You see things," he said, his voice low. "Not just what's in front of you. You see the whole board." "I see the shape of the cage," she corrected him softly. "And I know how to find the door." She took a deep breath. "They're getting bolder. They expect the ranchers to be watching the main trails, the open country. They won't be expecting a supply wagon." He frowned. "What are you saying?" "There's an old sheepherder's track," she said, her finger tracing a thin, looping line on the map. "It cuts across the valley floor, south of the main road. It's out in the open, but it's unused. If a lone wagon, seemingly unprotected, were to take that route around midday tomorrow—" "No," he said, the word a flat, hard wall. "Absolutely not. I won't have you playing bait." "This isn't about heroics." "Colt," she insisted, her voice steady, refusing to be cowed by his anger. "This is about being clever. They're watching the herds. They won't be able to resist the chance to pick off what looks like an easy target. Away from the main ranches, it would draw 2 or 3 of them out. Away from their main force, it would give you a chance to have a conversation with them, to find out exactly who they're working for." He stared at her, his jaw tight, his protective instincts at war with the cold, hard logic of her plan. He saw the woman he had sworn to protect, and he saw the strategist standing before him, offering a way to fight back not with brute force, but with intelligence. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the mantel. He listened. "All right," he said finally, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. "We do it, but on my terms." He held up a hand, ticking off the points. 1, you stay on the track, no matter what. 2, you will carry this. He produced a small, shrill whistle from a drawer. The moment you see them, you use it. 3. You will stay in sight of Sage Fork Rise at all times. I'll be there, watching. The moment I hear that whistle, I'm coming. So is Maceo Quinn. Maceo Quinn was an old, weathered tracker, half Apache, who lived in the hills and knew the territory better than the hawks that circled it. He was a man Colt trusted without reservation. Lila nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and fierce resolve. Agreed. The trap was set. The next day, under the merciless midday sun, Lila drove the buckboard along the old, dusty track. The wagon was loaded with canvas-covered barrels and sacks, making it look like a well-stocked supply run. From her vantage point, Sage Fork Rise was a constant, hazy presence on the horizon. She knew Colt and Maceo were up there, hidden, watching through a spyglass. But down on the valley floor, she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. After an hour that stretched for an eternity, she saw them, 2 riders, materializing from a dry wash, their faces covered with bandanas. They moved to flank her, their rifles held casually across their saddles. Her hands, slick with sweat, fumbled for the whistle around her neck. She raised it to her lips and blew. The sound was sharp and piercing, a blade of sound that cut through the oppressive silence. The rustlers spurred their horses, and from the rocks of Sage Fork Rise, 2 other riders exploded into view, charging down the slope with the speed of an avalanche. The trap had snapped shut. The fight was short and brutal. Colt and Maceo were not aiming to kill. They rode with a focused, violent efficiency, cutting off the rustlers' horses, forcing them into a stumbling, panicked run. Maceo, with a flick of his wrist, sent a rope spinning, snagging one man and pulling him clean out of the saddle. Colt rode alongside the other, his powerful horse slamming into the rustler's mount, and Colt himself launched from his saddle, tackling the man to the ground. By the time Lila reached them, both men were bound and disarmed. Colt was searching the pockets of the man he'd taken down. He pulled out a coil of rope, a clasp knife, a few coins, and then he pulled out something else. It was a small, crudely stamped token made of lead. Colt wiped the dust from it on his sleeve and held it in his palm. The emblem was unmistakable. It was a black cross laid over a sheaf of wheat. He looked up, his eyes finding Lila's. The rustlers, the sabotage, the dead calf, the hymn book, the whispered threats of Shaw Ringley, all the disparate, menacing rings of the circle suddenly snapped together, with Braxley Durin at its dark, smiling center. The circle was now tight, and they were standing in the middle of it. The sky, which had been a flat, searing sheet of brass for weeks, had turned a sick, bruised green by the time they reached the ranch. They had left the 2 bound rustlers with Maceo Quinn, who, with a grim nod, had begun the long, slow trek to the territorial marshal's office. A 2-day ride. The journey back to the ranch was silent, the air thick and electric, charged with the discovery of Durin's token. The world was holding its breath. Then the breath was released. It did not begin as a drizzle. The first drop hit the dust with a splat as loud as a coin, instantly turning a spot of gray powder to dark, red mud. A second later, the sky tore open. A sudden, violent monsoon swept down from the ridges, unleashing a wall of water that slammed into the parched earth. The wind howled, a physical blow, and, in an instant, the world vanished behind a curtain of driving rain. The dust, the product of a 6-month drought, rose up in a red cloud, met the downpour, and turned the ground into a slick, running river of what looked like red silk. "The shutters!" Colt yelled over the roar, already swinging down from his horse, not waiting for it to stop. Lila was off Jenny a second later, her skirts instantly soaked and heavy. They ran, blinded, to the house. The world had shrunk to the sound of the deluge drumming on the cedar roof, a sound like 1,000 frantic fists. Lightning, not in forks but in great silent sheets, skated across the horizon, illuminating the mesas in brief, ghostly flashes. The windmill, catching the gust, wasn't moaning. It was screaming, its veins spinning in a frantic, joyous blur. They burst into the house, the wind trying to rip the door from their hands. The small, orderly room was in chaos. Wind blasted through the open windows, scattering Lila's papers, and a pool of water was already forming on the floor. "I'll get the windows," Lila cried, grabbing the cloth she kept for washing. "The stock!" Colt yelled back, already grabbing a coil of rope. They worked without speaking, a sudden, efficient team. Lila slammed the wooden shutters, plunging the room into a deep, stormy twilight. The sound of the rain instantly muffled to a roar. She jammed towels against the bottom of the door and the window sills. Colt, soaked to the skin in the 30 seconds he'd been inside, ran back out into the deluge. The house smelled instantly of wet cedar, ozone, and the dark, rich scent of the coffee grounds Lila, in an act of domestic defiance, hurriedly put on the stove. A minute later, the door burst open again. Colt reappeared, dragging something behind him on a rope, something that was bleeding with a mixture of terror and profound indignation. It was the stray billy goat. "You can't leave him out in that," Lila said, her voice half laughter, half disbelief. "He's a fool. He'll drown himself." Colt growled, but there was no heat in it. He towed the goat, who shook himself violently and sprayed them both with muddy water, into the small kitchen area. "Stay," he ordered it, as if it were a dog. The goat, seeming to recognize a greater authority than the storm, merely let out a long-suffering, ridiculous baa, and began to chew thoughtfully on the leg of the kitchen table. It was an absurd, ridiculous creature, and in that moment, its presence felt almost holy, a small, stupid spark of life brought in from the flood. Colt barred the door. The sound of the bolt sliding home was final. The storm, the rustlers, Darlin, the drought, it was all out there. They were in here. The rain hushed the world, erasing everything beyond the four walls of the house. The only sounds were the roar on the roof, the bubble and hiss of the coffee pot, and the steady, rhythmic thump of the goat chewing on the table. They stood in the center of the room, dripping. "You're soaked," he said. "So are you," she replied. They moved to the hearth, where the embers from the morning fire still glowed. Colt added kindling, then a log, and in moments, a bright, cheerful fire was crackling, pushing back the stormy gloom. They moved with a shared, unspoken understanding. They peeled off their wet boots, setting them by the fire. Lila hung their drenched coats on pegs, where they dripped onto the stone. They sat on the braided rug before the hearth, pulling off their wet socks and setting them on the fender, where they immediately began to steam. Lila poured 2 tin mugs of coffee, the scalding liquid a comfort in her cold hands. They sat, shoulders nearly touching, staring into the flames. The light of the fire danced on their faces, catching the dampness in Lila's hair and the weary lines around Colt's eyes. For a long time, they just listened to the storm. It was a shelter of sound. It was in this shelter that Lila finally found the words. "He had a way of looking at us," she said, her voice so low it was almost part of the rain. Colt didn't move, but his profile hardened. He knew instantly who he was. "Darlin," she continued, her gaze fixed on the fire. "He'd call us his lost lambs, but he never looked at us like we were souls. He looked at us like we were ewes for shearing." She took a shaky breath, finally admitting the one true thing she had never said aloud, the detail that haunted her more than any threat. It wasn't coarse. It was worse. It was appraisal. The way a man looks at a horse he's thinking of buying, checking the teeth, the legs. He would weigh us. He would weigh me with his eyes, like cattle at an auction. She felt a tear, hot and angry, slip down her cheek. He'd talk about finding us godly homes, but he was just sorting us. This one for a saloon in a mining town. This one for a house in Tucson. This one, her voice broke, for a lonely man on a ranch who'd paid for a bride. She clutched the mug, her knuckles white. He told me I was not property, and then he sold me. Colt's hand, resting on his knee, slowly clenched into a fist. The silence that followed was thick, filled with the violence he was holding back. He understood the language of property, of brands, of ownership. He understood the violation she was describing better than any other man might. He let the silence stretch, giving her confession the respect it deserved. When he finally spoke, his own voice was a low, rough rumble, scraped raw by memory. "Idle hands make loud ghosts," he said, quoting himself. Mine are from Tennessee." Lila turned her head, looking at him properly for the first time that night. His face was a map of shadows in the firelight. "It was during the war," he said, his gaze distant, seeing not the fire, but another one. "Long ago. I was a scout. My company, my commanding officer, he was a man who believed God was on his side, and it made him cruel. He ordered us to cleanse a valley, burn it all, farms, barns, a church." He paused, and the old pain was visible on his face. It was just a building, wood and glass, but it was full of hymn books, a baptismal font. It was shelter, and the order was to burn it. He said it was a nest of sympathizers. I couldn't. He looked down at his scarred hands, as if seeing them for the first time. I told him no. He drew his pistol, called me a coward and a traitor. I just walked away. I rode north and I never looked back. I learned that day that some orders are just a man's wickedness given a flag to hide behind. My ghosts, they're not from the men I fought. They're from the man I refused to be, and the sanctuary I refused to burn. He had matched her confession. He had shown her the core of himself, a man who, when faced with an impossible choice, had chosen to protect shelter, even at the cost of his honor, his home, his past. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. It was, finally, shelter. Lila set her mug down on the hearth. He had given her his deepest truth, his greatest shame, which she saw only as his greatest strength. Her heart, which had been a cold, tight knot of fear, felt suddenly, achingly full. She reached out, her fingers, small and trembling slightly, touched the back of his clenched fist. He did not flinch. Slowly, she unfurled his fingers, one by one, releasing the tension from them. She turned his hand over and looked at it. It was a map of his life, calloused from work, scarred from old fights, strong. Then, in a gesture of profound, terrifying trust, she lifted his hand. She pressed it, palm flat, against her chest, right over her heartbeat, her own hand covering his, holding him there. The fabric of her dress was damp and warm. Beneath it, beneath her ribs, he could feel it, the steady, solid thump of her heart. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes wide and clear, locked on his. "It's steady. With you, it's finally steady." He was undone. This woman, who had every right to a heart that fluttered like a trapped bird, was offering him her peace. His breath hitched. His gaze traveled from her eyes, to her hand covering his, to her mouth, soft and unsmiling in the firelight. The rain lashed the windows, a world away. Slowly, as if afraid she would shatter, he raised his other hand. He brushed a stray, damp strand of hair from her cheek, his rough fingers impossibly gentle against her skin. The touch was electric, a quiet hum that vibrated through her. He left his fingers there, his thumb just brushing the corner of her jaw, and he looked at her. He did not speak. He didn't need to. His eyes, pale and full of a terrible, quiet reverence, asked the question. She answered by closing her eyes and leaning in. Their kiss was not a collision. It was a discovery. It was unhurried, a hesitant first touch of lips, breath warmed and tasting faintly of coffee. It was the shock of his mustache, soft, and the slight roughness of his jaw against her skin. It was a kiss of profound recognition, a silent acknowledgement of the souls they had just bared. It deepened, not with demand, but with a slow, unfolding relief. His hand moved from her jaw, sliding to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her damp hair, holding her gently, securely. His other hand, the one she had held to her heart, moved to her waist, a solid, grounding presence that did not pull, did not demand, but simply held. Her own hands found their place. The one that had covered his now rested on his sternum, feeling his own heart, which was hammering a counter-rhythm to hers. Her other hand came up to rest on his shoulder, her fingers gripping the solid, warm muscle, anchoring herself to this man who had become her rock, her guardian, her home. They kissed for a long time, and the kiss was a language all its own. It said, "I see you." It said, "I am not afraid." It said, "We are safe." When they finally broke, they didn't move apart. They rested their foreheads together, breathing the same air. Their eyes closed. The fire crackled. The rain drummed. The room had grown cooler, the fire burning low. Colt stirred, his movements slow. He rose and went to his own cot, retrieving the heavy, folded Navajo blanket. He came back to her and sat, spreading the thick, woven wool over both of them, creating a new, shared shelter. They didn't go to separate beds. They lay down together on the braided rug, in the dying warm light of the fire, fully clothed. The storm raged outside, but inside, the world was reduced to this one small, safe, warm space. Lila rested her head on his shoulder, her palm flat against his chest, right over his heart. Colt's arm was solid around her, and his chin came to rest in her hair. The wind sang its long, low song over the chimney. The goat in the kitchen sighed in its sleep. They lay still, listening to the rain, safe from the ghosts, safe from the world. Some rooms, and the weary souls who find shelter within them, deserve to have their doors closed. The storm sang them to sleep. Lila woke to the smell of rain-washed earth and the unfamiliar feeling of safety. The storm had passed, leaving the world scoured clean. She was still on the braided rug before the hearth, covered by the heavy Navajo blanket. She wasn't alone. Colt was lying beside her, his arm still resting protectively over her waist, his breathing deep and even. He was asleep, truly asleep, for what she guessed was the first time in months. The lines of exhaustion and worry that were etched around his eyes had softened. In the gray, pre-dawn light, he looked younger, more vulnerable. She lay still, not wanting to disturb him, simply taking inventory of this new, fragile reality. The house was quiet, save for the drip, drip, drip of water from the eaves. The goat, a ridiculous guardian, was asleep by the kitchen table, its beard resting in a puddle of its own droll. She felt his heart beating, slow and steady, against her back. This, she thought, was the shelter they had both been searching for. This was the silence that was not empty. Her movement, though slight, was enough. His eyes opened instantly. There was no disorientation, no slow awakening. One moment he was asleep, the next he was completely, alertly awake, his gaze finding hers in the dim light. The pale gray of his eyes, so often the color of a coming storm, was now the color of the sky after it clear, calm, and deep. He said nothing. He just looked at her, and in that look, she saw the acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them. The confessions, the kiss, the shared watch in the dark. A slow smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Mornin'," he whispered. "Good morning," she whispered back, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. He let out a long, slow breath, a sign of attention he hadn't even known he was holding finally releasing. But the peace was shattered by a sound from outside. A single, sharp clang. It was the sound of a horseshoe hitting a stone. Colt was on his feet in one silent, fluid motion, pulling his boots on, his shirt still unbuttoned. He grabbed the Henry rifle from where it leaned against the wall. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice no longer soft. "Bar the door behind me." He slipped outside, and Lila scrambled to the door, sliding the heavy timber bar into place. Her heart, so steady moments before, was now a frantic drum. She ran to her bedroom window, the one that faced the corral, and peered through a crack in the shutters. The morning had broken impossibly clear. The air was sharp and cold, and the ground was a sea of dark, red mud. Colt stood on the porch, his rifle held low, his body a study in absolute stillness. He was scanning the property. Lila followed his gaze. At first, she saw nothing. Then, she saw what he saw. Hoof prints. They were everywhere, but they weren't the frantic, scattered tracks of a panicked herd. They were a single, deliberate line, a perfect, circling perimeter. Just beyond the light cast by the house windows, they had been watched all night. The riders had sat out there, in the driving rain, waiting for the storm to pass, waiting for the dawn. Colt moved off the porch, his boots sinking deep into the mud. He walked toward the windmill. Lila knew he had strung a thin, almost invisible tripwire from the windmill's base to a small bell hidden on the porch, an alarm against just such a night visit. He followed the wire, his eyes on the ground. He stopped, knelt, and then looked back at the house, his face grim. He didn't need to say a word. She knew. The wire had been cut. They hadn't just been scouting. They were here. As if summoned by the realization, they emerged. They came not from the road, but from the shadow of the low stone wall that marked the boundary of the widow Carraway's property. 4 of them. They moved on foot, leading their horses, their forms dark against the new sun. Lila recognized the 2 in front from the trap she had set, the big, brutish one, Harlan Jude, and the nervous, twitchy one, Squint Rafe. The 2 behind them were masked, their identities lost to shadow and cloth. They spread out, using the stone wall as cover, their rifles evident. Then, 2 more riders appeared from the main road. The first was Deputy Shaw Ringley. He sat his horse, 50 yards back, a man trying to look official, his badge polished and shining brightly on his vest. He was the legal cover, the thin veneer of lawfulness for what was about to happen. The last rider came last. Braxley Preacher Darlin rode up not like a thief, but like a circuit judge, his back straight, his black coat immaculate. He reined in his horse between his men and the deputy. He wasn't carrying a rifle. He was holding his thick, leather-bound Bible, holding it high like a cross to ward off devils, or a standard to lead a charge. His sermons, Colt had once heard, always started with smoke. Today, it seemed, his sermon would start with mud. Colt walked back to the porch, his movements slow, deliberate. He did not run. He did not seek cover. He stood at the top of the 3 steps, the Henry resting in the crook of his arm, and waited. Lila moved from the window, her hand on the bar. "Lila, no," he said, his voice low and urgent, not looking back. "Keep it barred, no matter what." But she couldn't. This was not his fight alone. Not anymore. She slid the bar back and stepped out onto the porch, coming to stand just behind his shoulder. He tensed, but didn't send her back. He knew she had made her choice. Darlin's voice, oily and powerful, boomed across the yard. "Good morning, sinners. The Lord has washed the world clean and given us a new day to reckon." "Darlin," Colt called back, his voice flat, carrying easily in the clean air. "You're a long way from your tent." "I go where the Lord directs me, Mr. Merriweather." Darlin smiled, a wide, predatory flash of white teeth. And he has directed me to retrieve my lost lamb. Harlan Jude, impatient with the theater, spit a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. Enough talk, preacher. Merriweather, we're here for the woman in your herd. Give 'em up, and the deputy here will see you ain't charged with harboring a fugitive. A fugitive, Lila's voice, clear and cold, cut through the men's posturing. Doran's smile tightened, his eyes fixed on her. Sister Lila, you broke your sacred covenant with my ministry, an indenture signed by your own hand. He produced a sheaf of folded papers from his coat pocket, flourishing them. Deputy Ringley is here to enforce my legal claim. You are my property, girl, bought and paid for. Lila felt the old, cold panic try to rise, the ghost of the girl who had fled the mercantile. But she looked at the man beside her, at the solid set of his shoulders, and she felt the warmth of the Navajo blanket, the memory of his hand on her heart. She was not that girl. She stepped forward, past Colt's protective arm, to the very edge of the porch. Her gaze was not on Darlin. It was on Shaw Ringley. I am not property, she said, her voice shaking, but not with fear. It was shaking with a righteous, burning rage. She pointed a finger at Darlin. That man is a liar and a thief. He sells women. He brands cattle that aren't his. And your ink, she said, her eyes boring into Darlin's, means nothing here. The yard was silent. The sheer, unadulterated defiance of her words hung in the air. Shaw Ringley, flustered, felt his authority being challenged. Merriweather, Ringley shouted, his voice cracking. This is a legal matter. I am ordering you to disarm and turn over the woman. Put down that rifle. Colt didn't even look at him. His eyes were on Darlin's men, who were starting to finger their triggers, their nervousness growing. But Colt wasn't just watching them. He knew, with a certainty that was absolute, that they were not alone. He had sent a rider into town late last night, after the storm broke, with a message for Maceo Quinn. He knew the old tracker was out there, somewhere. And then he saw him. A flicker of movement, nothing more than a shadow detaching itself from another shadow. Maceo was ghosting up behind the massive, stone-lined cistern, his movements utterly silent. He held a scattergun, its wide mouth a dark promise. He was the surprise, kept for need. Colt had to buy time. He had to draw their eyes. So that's it. Shaw, Colt called out, his voice conversational. A man just talking to his neighbor. You're backing Darlin's paper. What about the proof? What about the lead token we took off his rustler, the one with the cross and the wheat? This caused a ripple of confusion. Harlan Jude's head snapped toward Darlin. What's he talking about? Preacher? Darlin's face darkened. Lie's a desperate trick. But the seed was planted. The men were looking at each other, not at the house. And in that moment, Colt's eyes flicked, just once, to the side. He wasn't looking at Lila. He was looking at the long, iron brake lever at the base of the windmill. Lila saw the look. She understood. After weeks of listening to the windmill's hums, she knew its language. She knew the power of the brake, and she knew that the storm had filled the cistern to overflowing, and that the troughs below it were placed directly in the center of the yard, right where the rustler's horses stood. While all eyes were on Colt, locked in his war of words, Lila moved. She didn't run. She stepped off the porch, her boots sinking into the mud, and walked with deliberate, terrifying calm toward the windmill. Girl, get back here, Darlin bellowed. Harlan Jude raised his rifle. Colt, call her off. But it was too late. Lila grabbed the iron lever with both hands and, with all her strength, yanked. The brake disengaged with a loud screech. The windmill vanes, catching the strong morning breeze, spun with a roar. The pump, no longer locked, slammed into action. A powerful, gushing torrent of water burst from the pipe, overflowing the main trough in seconds. It slammed into the secondary trough, and then a wave of cold, Clean water flooded the yard, turning the soft mud into a slick, bottomless quagmire of red clay. The rustlers' horses were the first to panic. They screamed as the ground dissolved beneath their feet. Harlan Jude's horse scrambled, lost its footing, and went down on its haunches, trapping his leg. Squint Rafe's mount reared, eyes rolling, and started to spin, hopelessly mired. "Now, Maceo!" Colt roared. A deafening boom ripped through the morning. Maceo Quinn rose from behind the cistern and fired the scattergun, not at them, but skyward. The blast was the signal. It was pure chaos. Men were shouting, horses were screaming. Shaw Ringley, the pillar of law, tried to wheel his horse around, to be part of the action, to restore an order he had helped destroy, but his fine sorrel slipped in the new, slick clay. The horse went down, and Ringley tumbled from the saddle, not with a thud, but with a wet, sickening snap. He cried out, a high-pitched, broken sound, clutching his shoulder. His badge, the symbol of his authority, ripped free from his vest. It flew through the air and skittered across the mud, spinning like a spent silver coin before landing face down in the muck. It was a sound everyone would remember. In the chaos, one man was not focused on the mud or the horses. Braxley Doran, who had dismounted earlier, saw his entire plan dissolving. He saw Lila, standing by the windmill, her face pale but triumphant. His property, his lost lamb, had done this. His face, which had been a mask of piety, contorted into something raw and unrecognizable. With a roar of pure, primal rage, he lunged for her. "You!" Colt was already moving. He couldn't use the rifle, not this close, not with Lila so near. He met Duran's charge with his own body. He intercepted him. A collision of two opposing forces. Duran was heavier, and he slammed his shoulder and a heavy fist into Colt's ribs. Lila heard the sickening thud and saw Colt grunt, the air driven from his lungs. The pain was sharp, a crackle of fire, but he did not go down. He grabbed Duran's coat and shoved him back, creating a precious second of space. Lila saw Colt take the hit. Terror and rage warred in her. She looked around, desperate. The goat, the saintly fool, had been spooked by the shotgun blast and was huddled by the porch steps, its yellow eyes wide. Lila didn't scream for help. She jammed two fingers into her mouth and blew the sharp, piercing whistle she had used in the trap. The goat's head snapped up. It associated that whistle with action, with the charge of horses. It saw the nearest, most threatening thing Duran, recovering his balance, his hands raised to grab Colt. The goat did what goats do. It lowered its thick, horned head, took two quick steps, and slammed with the force of a small, hairy cannonball into the back of Braxley Duran's knees. Duran's legs buckled. His arms flew wide, his eyes wide with shocked betrayal. He collapsed, not with a shout, but with a wet foomp, face first into the thickest, deepest part of the clay. His expensive, black Bible flew from his hand and landed, splayed open, in the mud. "The gate," Colt yelled, grabbing Lila's hand. The immediate threat was gone. They ran to the main ranch gate as the rustlers, Harlan Jude and Squint Rafe, finally freed their horses from the mud, their faces grim. But as Colt and Lila reached the gate, dragging the heavy reserve timbers to jam it shut, they heard a new sound, shouts from the road. Cresting the rise was not a new wave of enemies. It was the town. Maceo's shot had been the alarm. Drawn by the sound, the neighbors were coming. Widow Caraway was in the lead, sitting straight in her wagon, holding an old, long-barreled fowling piece. Beside her was Elsie Pike, the schoolmarm, her face pale, but her hands clutching a fireplace poker. Behind them were two teamsters from the livery, running, carrying axes. The rustlers saw it all. Their leader was face down in the mud. The deputy was broken. They were trapped between an armed rancher and his tracker, and the arriving, angry town. Harlan Jude made the decision. He yelled at his men. They abandoned their horses, scrambled over the low stone wall, and began to run, fleeing on foot toward the only sanctuary they had left, the Badlands of Rattlespur Gulch. The siege was broken. Colt and Lila stood by the jammed gate, breathing hard, their hands still linked. Maceo walked out from behind the cistern, the scattergun smoking. Shaw Ringley was moaning, trying to sit up, his arm at a sickening, unnatural angle. And Darlin, the false prophet, was trying to rise. He was a sputtering, coughing, mud-caked mockery of a man. Widow Caraway pulled her wagon to a halt, her eyes hard and cold, fixing on him. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with acid, "if it isn't the man who salts a widow's flour." One of the teamsters, seeing Darlin, grabbed the rope that had brought the goat into the house, the widow's clothesline, with a look at Colt, who gave a single, grim nod. The teamster fashioned a quick loop, not around his neck, but under his arms. He tossed the other end over a high beam on the porch. "This is assault," Darlin sputtered, mud flying from his lips. "I am a man of God, I have rights." "You're a sermon gone wrong, preacher." The teamster grunted. He and his partner hauled on the rope. Darlin was lifted, unceremoniously, his feet kicking 6 inches above the mud he had created. They tied him off, leaving him to spin slowly, a trussed, humiliated piñata of piety, defeated by a woman, a goat, and a flood of his own making. The Cinder Mesa schoolhouse was not built for a reckoning, but it would serve. The children's desks, carved with the bored initials of a dozen pupils, had been shoved against the walls, in their place. Rough-hewn benches from the church and every spare chair from the mesquite house were crowded with the citizens of the valley. They sat shoulder to shoulder, a silent, grim-faced jury of ranchers, teamsters, wives, and merchants. The air was thick, hot, and still. The only movement, the golden dust motes that danced in the high, bright shafts of sunlight, turning in the air like tiny, angelic witnesses. At the front, seated at Elsie Pike's modest desk, was Judge Alastair Harrow. He was a circuit judge, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and pragmatism, his eyes weary from having seen every flavor of human failing the territory had to offer. Braxley Darlin stood before him, no longer the mud-caked, spinning fool from the clothesline. He was washed, his black coat brushed, his hair slicked back. He held his large, leather-bound Bible in one hand, a shield of piety, and the sheaf of Lila's contracts in the other, a weapon of law. He was, once again, a portrait of aggrieved righteousness. Beside him, looking small and defeated, was Shaw Ringley, his arm in a fresh white sling, his face a mottled pasty gray. His badge was still pinned to his vest, but it looked tarnished. "This is an outrage, Your Honor," Darlin began, his voice resonating with its familiar, practiced boom. "A public humiliation, orchestrated by a cabal of jealous neighbors and this fallen woman." He shook the papers at Lila, who sat in the front row, flanked by Colt and Maceo Quinn. "I have a legal, binding indenture. This woman, Lila Rowan, belongs to my ministry, to be placed as I see fit. I am a man of God, bringing order to the wilderness, and I have been set upon, assaulted." Judge Harrow held up a hand. The gesture was small, but it cut Darlin's performance short. "Mr. Darlin, your grievance is noted, but you are not the one pressing charges here. You are the one answering them. Mrs. Merriweather," he said, his gaze turning to Lila. "You have made a claim that this man is a trafficker and is tied to the rustling that has been bleeding this valley. That is a heavy accusation. The floor is yours." Lila stood. She did not look at Darlin. She looked at the judge. She held no Bible, no sheaf of false contracts. She held only her small, scarred leather notebook. "His name is Braxley Darlin," she said, her voice not loud, but it cut through the silence, reaching every corner of the room. It was not the voice of a victim. It was the voice of a witness. He does not place women. He trades them. He has done so for at least 3 years, from Colorado to the New Mexico territory. Lies, slander from a wicked tongue, Darlin roared. On March 12th, 1,885 inches, Lila continued, her voice overriding his, her eyes on the judge. He placed a girl named Clara Evans, from Missouri, with a saloon keeper in Trinidad, Colorado. The donation for this placement was $40. A low murmur went through the room. Darlin's face began to lose its pious sheen. On May 4th, 1,885 inches, Lila went on, turning a page. He placed 2 sisters, Anne and Mary Beth Sutter, with a man running a boarding house for minors near Silverton. The price was $60 for the pair. "This is fantasy," Darlin shouted, his knuckles white on his Bible. On August 10th, she said, her voice dropping, he placed a girl named Sarah Beth Combs, who was only 16, with a man outside Leadville. She was found in the winter, frozen, half a mile from his cabin. Darlin was gone by then. His donations, Your Honor, our prices, these contracts. She gestured to the papers in his hand. Our bills of sale. She looked at Elsie Pike, the schoolmarm, who was twisting a handkerchief in her hands. Miss Pike. Elsie Pike stood, trembling. He came to the schoolhouse. Last month, he said he was a pastor, looking to see if any families needed aid. But the way he looked at the older girls, she swallowed, her face pale. He wasn't looking at them like children. He was assessing them. That was his word. He asked me about their family situations. Which ones were poor? Which ones had no father? He was shopping. A rancher in the back row, whose daughter was one of Elsie's pupils, rose halfway from his seat, his face dark with a father's rage, before his wife pulled him back down. "And what of the widow?" Judge Harrow asked, his voice now like chipped flint. Widow Caraway stood, her back a steel rod. "I have no daughter for him to assess, Judge, but I have flour, a whole barrel, poisoned with lye, after this man's hirelings were seen at my pantry door, the same day Mr. Merriweather mended my fence." "This is circumstantial," Shaw Ringley finally spoke, his voice reedy with pain. "It's a personal dispute. This woman, she trapped Mr. Darlin, and Mr. Merriweather has a personal grievance. This is not a matter for the law." Judge Harrow turned his cold eyes on the deputy. "Then perhaps you can explain, Deputy, why you were present at the Merriweather Ranch, in the company of these armed men, while they attempted to seize this woman by force." I was there to enforce a legal document," Shaw stammered. "I was keeping the peace." "By lending your badge to an attempted kidnapping," the judge countered. "You can't prove any of it," Darlin bellowed, his composure finally breaking. "You have no proof I'm tied to these rustlers. It's her word, a runaway's lies." "Tracks, however," a new voice said, quiet as dust. "Do not lie." Maceo Quinn stood. He walked to the front, holding nothing but his hat in his hands. He addressed the judge, but he spoke to the room. "A man's boot," he said, "is like his signature. The way he wears the heel, the way his weight falls. The man who poisoned the widow's flower. He has a habit of twisting his left foot, wears the heel down on the outside. The same boot print was at the Merriweather's windmill, where the grit was poured. The same man rode out with the party this morning." He then looked at Shaw. "The horse tracks. Deputy, your sorrel was there, at the widow's gate, the night before the flour was salted. You weren't there to keep the peace. You were there to show them the target." Shaw Ringley's face went from gray to white. The room was utterly silent. Maceo had read the earth, and the earth had confessed. He had, with simple, irrefutable logic, read the conspiracy into the record like scripture. Judge Harrow looked at Colt, who had not spoken a word. Mr. Merriweather, you are the one who has lost the most in this. A calf, your windmill, your peace. You have anything to add? Colt stood slowly. He, too, faced the judge. But his words were for his neighbors. His voice was not loud, but it filled the room. This land is hard, he said. It asks a lot. It doesn't forgive mistakes, but it's honest. He looked at Darlin, his eyes flat and cold. Then men like this come. They don't respect the land. They don't respect the work. They see a valley as a thing to be bled, and people as things to be used. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the townsfolk. Wolves run in packs. They test fences. They look for the weak, the isolated. They think because a man is quiet, he is weak. They think because a ranch is small, it can be broken. He rested his hand on Lila's shoulder. I will not let wolves run this valley while my fence still stands. He sat down. It was a vow, made not just to his wife, but to the entire community. Before the judge could speak, the door to the schoolhouse burst open. The young telegraph operator, his visor askew, ran in, waving a strip of paper. Judge Harrow! This just came over the wire, he panted. The territorial marshals, they're en route from Santa Fe. They got Maceo's message. They're coming for Darlin. They've had word on him from 3 other territories. He wasn't finished. And this, sir, from the rail agent in Albuquerque. The railroad is planning to survey a spur line through Turnstone Wash. They're offering a $500 reward for the arrest of the rustlers who have been cutting stock in that area. They're calling it economic sabotage. The room exploded. It was no longer a local dispute. It was a federal matter, a railroad matter. Darlin's ministry was a criminal enterprise, and he had been stupid enough to interfere with the railroad's money. Darlin's face, for the first time, showed real, abject fear. His bluster was gone. He was a small, failed man in a black coat. Judge Harrow banged the schoolmarm's gavel on the desk. Silence, silence. The room quieted. The judge looked at Darlin, his face a mask of cold disgust. Braxley Darlin, given this testimony and the warrant from the U.S. Marshals, I am holding you on charges of trafficking, conspiracy, and sabotage. You will be held in the Cinder Mesa jail to await their arrival. Then, he turned his gaze on Shaw Ringley. Deputy, a badge is a trust, given to you by the people you serve. You have not just broken that trust. You have actively betrayed it. You used your authority to aid a predator and to terrorize your neighbors. He pointed a finger. Take it off. Shaw stared at him, his mouth open. Judge, I my arm. Take it off. Harrow's voice was a command. With his one good hand, his fingers trembling. Shaw Ringley fumbled with the pin. He unhooked the small, silver badge and held it. On the desk, Harrow ordered. Shaw stepped forward. His head bowed and dropped the badge on the desk. The small, metallic clatter was the loudest sound the schoolhouse had ever heard. It was the sound of a decade's worth of fear and petty corruption coming to an end. Across the room, a collective breath was released. It was a sigh, a murmur, a quiet exhalation of a tension the valley had held for years. Judge Harrow banged his gavel. This hearing is adjourned. As people began to stand, to talk, to crowd the aisle, Lila walked to the front. The teamsters were already hauling a pail, shaking Darlin to his feet. Lila ignored him. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, lead revival token they had taken from the rustler. She placed it on the desk, on top of Shaw's surrendered badge. She looked at Darlin, who was being led away. That cross, she said, her voice clear and steady, means nothing without mercy. She turned, met Colt's waiting eyes, and he took her hand. They walked out of the schoolhouse together, into the bright, clean day. And as they stepped onto the porch, the first drops of rain began to fall. It was not the violent, angry monsoon. It was a long, slow, soaking rain, a rain that smelled of wet dust and forgiveness. It beaded on the dry leaves of the cottonwoods, and the townsfolk, one by one, stepped out onto the street, turning their faces up to the sky. The drought had broken. The valley was drinking. It felt to every soul in Cinder Mesa like amends. The rain fell for 2 days. On the 3rd day, the sun rose on a new world, one washed clean, the air cool and the earth dark and rich. At the Merriweather Ranch, the silence was broken by the sound of hammers. Colt was at the base of the windmill, but he was not alone. The teamster who had tied up Darlin was on the ladder. Widow Caraway was sorting bolts into coffee tins. Elsie Pike and 3 other ranchers were hauling the new, repaired windmill head into place. The siege had isolated Colt. The reckoning had made him a neighbor. They were raising the new head together. Colt and the teamster cinched the final bolt. "All right," Colt yelled. "Engage the brake. Let's see if she holds." The brake was thrown. The vanes caught the wind, and with a low, healthy, beautiful hum, the pump engaged. A moment later, a clean, powerful gush of fresh water poured into the cistern, sparking a cheer from the small crowd. Lila stood on the porch, watching. She watched Colt laugh, a real, unguarded laugh. As the teamster clapped him on the shoulder, she watched the water. A promise kept. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table and opened her old, scarred notebook. She turned to the last entry. "He stayed. That is a sentence I do not know to hold." She picked up her pen and, on the final page, she wrote one last line. "Today, we brought in the new water. We held it." She closed the book. She did not put it away to forget. She put it on the shelf, a closed chapter, a finished story of survival. Then, she took out a new book, one she had bought from Mrs. Hode at the Mercantile. It was a thick, sturdy ledger, meant for accounts. She opened it to the first, clean page. At the top, in her neat, clear script, she wrote, "Home Ledger." She dipped her pen, thought for a moment, and made her first entries. Fence posts, mended 20. Seed, corn and bean 2 bags. Neighbors helped 5. Small joys kept 1. Weeks bled into a month, and the valley healed. The long, soaking rains had turned the parched earth a deep, hopeful green. New grass, vibrant and impossibly soft, carpeted the ground where dust had reigned for a year. The creek in Turnstone Wash, which had been a dry, rocky scar, now ran with clear, cold water. The morning air, once sharp with dust, now carried the sweet, clean scent of wet mesquite and the warm, living smell of horses. The mornings were no longer silent. They were stitched together by the bright, melodic song of the meadowlarks, a sound of such simple, uncomplicated joy it felt like a benediction. Inside the small ranch house, which now felt less like a structure and more like a home, Colt stood before a small, cracked mirror he had propped against the wall. In his hand, he held his straight razor. He was shaving, something Lila had never seen him do. He usually kept a few days' worth of rough stubble, a practical armor against the sun and wind. But today, he was shaving clean, the blade scraping away the last vestiges of the hard, solitary man he had been. He was concentrating on the task, his jaw tight, but his hands, the same hands that could calm a spooked horse, mend a broken fence, or face down a rustler without a tremor, were shaking. They shook more than they had the day guns had spoken in his yard. This was a different kind of courage, a more terrifying one. It was the courage to hope. When he was finished, he splashed his face with cold water from the basin. He looked at his reflection. It was the face of a stranger, younger, the lines of weariness less pronounced, the hard edges softened. It was the face of a man who was about to gamble everything he had, not on a card game or a land claim, but on a single question. He found Lila behind the porch, tending to the white yucca plants. They had taken root, their spiky green leaves reaching for the sun, a stubborn testament to her own resilience. She looked up as he approached. a smudge of dark earth on her cheek. She smiled, a real, easy smile that still made his heart ache in a way he was just learning to understand. "The yucca are happy," she said, her voice full of the quiet satisfaction of a gardener. "They're not the only ones," he said, his own voice sounding rough and unfamiliar to his own ears. He held out a hand. "Walk with me." She took his hand without hesitation. Her hand, now calloused in new places from the work of the ranch, fit into his as if it had always belonged there. He led her not toward the house, or the barn, or the road, but toward the windmill. They stood in its shade. The sun was climbing high. But here, in the shadow of the tall, turning vanes, it was cool. The metal structure, once a source of screaming anxiety, now hummed its low, healthy song. The sound of their shared lifeblood. The shadow of the turning vanes swept over their boots, slow and steady, like the hand of a great clock that was no longer measuring out minutes of fear, but years of peace. It was a clock for giving time. They stood in a comfortable silence for a long time, listening to the hum, watching the shadow turn. Finally, Colt released her hand. He reached into the pocket of his clean shirt, his fingers, still trembling slightly, closed around a small, smooth object. He drew it out and held it in his palm. It was a ring. It was not a ring of gold or silver. It was carved from a piece of desert ironwood, a wood so dense it sinks in water, so resilient it can last for centuries. He had polished it until it was as smooth and dark as river glass, the grain a deep, swirling pattern of reds and blacks, and inlaid into the dark wood was a thin, bright sliver of brass. Lila's breath caught. She recognized it instantly. It was a piece of the old, damaged windmill vane, the one they had taken down together, the one that had been sabotaged and then replaced. He had taken a piece of their hardship, their shared trial, and made it into a thing of beauty. "Lila," he began, his voice low and tight. He cleared his throat. "The first time you came to this place, it was because of paper and fear. It was a contract. It was a cage you ran to, hoping it was better than the one you ran from." He looked at her, and his pale, rainless eyes were full of a raw, aching vulnerability that stripped her bare. "I don't want the woman from the paper," he said. "I don't want the woman who was afraid. I want the woman who mends my shirts. I want the woman who laughs at a goat, who can read a map better than a tracker, who can stand on her own 2 feet and face down a devil with nothing but the truth." He held out the ring. "This ain't a contract, it's a question. Stay now because you choose to. Stay now and build a life with me. Every day. We both wake up and we both choose. That's all I'm asking for. Your choice." Tears welled in Lila's eyes. They were not the hot, angry tears of her past. They were warm, cleansing tears, and they spilled over, tracing paths through the smudge of dirt on her cheek. And then a sound escaped her. The same sound he had heard by the corral, that small, rusty skitter of laughter. But this time it was full and free, breaking through the tears. "I'm still shaking," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. A slow, brilliant smile broke across his face, the smile that reached his eyes and made them look like the sky after a storm. "Good," he said softly. "Let's call it joy." She didn't need a church or a preacher or a room full of witnesses. The only witnesses she needed were the wide, open sky and the meadowlark that chose that exact moment to stitch its song into the silence. She looked at this quiet, honorable man, this man who had stood guard in her darkest hour, who had shown her his ghosts, who had made a symbol of their future from a piece of their broken past. "Yes," she said. The word was not loud. It was a breath. It was a vow. But in the vast quiet of the valley, her choice sounded louder than any choir. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. The dark wood was warm against her skin, the sliver of brass bright in the sun. They didn't rush to kiss. The moment was too sacred, too profound for that. Instead, he stepped closer, and they stood forehead to forehead, their eyes closed. They took inventory of the things that mattered: the shared breath, the tandem rhythm of their heartbeats, the solid, undeniable feeling of belonging. This was the foundation. This was the post and the beam. This was the house a promise had built. After a long, perfect moment, she leaned back, though their foreheads were still touching. A playful light danced in her tear-bright eyes. "Colt Merriweather," she whispered, "will you dance with me?" He looked around at the empty yard, a look of profound confusion on his face. "Lila, there's no music." She smiled, a slow, beautiful smile that held all the secrets of their shared past and all the hope of their future. "There's wind," she said. He stared at her for a second, and then he laughed, a real deep laugh that came from his soul. He took her hand and led her from the shade of the windmill out into the sunshine, onto the new, soft grass. He kicked off his boots. She, in turn, slipped off her own worn shoes. Barefoot in the new grass, he drew her close. He held her at the small of her back, his hand firm and sure. She rested her hand on his shoulder, and her fingers, by instinct, found the old, puckered scar there, the one from a life he had left behind. But her touch was not one of pity. It was a blessing, an acceptance of every part of him, the broken and the whole. He began to move, a slow, simple turn. There was no music but the whisper of the wind through the juniper and the steady, rhythmic hum of the windmill. It was their tempo. It was the song of their life. The tall, white yucca blooms, her mother's favorite, nodded in the breeze as if in approval. The cistern, full to the brim, glinted in the sun, a kept promise of new, clean water. And as they turned, slow and laughing quiet, two solitary figures finding their rhythm in the vast, open land. They were, for the first time, alive enough to hear the world love them back. Thank you for listening to this story. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I'd love to connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like this video. And if you can, support it further by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.